Okay, we're going to be looking at the poem Bayonet Charge. And just so you're aware, a bayonet is a type of bladed weapon. Okay, so it's normally attached to a rifle, and it's something that soldiers would have used in the war. So I also want you to think of the idea of a charge. Now, there's another poem in the cluster, Charge of the Light Brigade, but you think of a charge as a sort of attack. So I want you to really think about the connotations of that word and think about how relevant they are in the context of this poem. So, Bayonet Charge is actually quite a modern poem. It's written by Ted Hughes, who only recently died in 1998. And it portrays sort of the final desperate moments of a soldier's charge over the trenches, which is quite interesting because Hughes didn't actually experience the war firsthand. A lot of war poetry is written by soldiers who are actually in that moment. But he was really heavily influenced by Wilfred Owen, who's another poet in our cluster. And his father was actually one of the soldiers in the First World War. So we think that he might have drawn on his father's experiences here. Now, as with all of the poems in the cluster, it's important for you to think about making links, because that's a huge part of the mark scheme, is being able to compare that, so talking about what is similar and what is different to another poem in the cluster. I've got some suggested links here, but this is not an exclusive list. So as you know, this poem is going to be about war. So there are a few key ones where war is a very strong theme. Exposure, Charge of the Light Brigade, Remains, War Photographer, Kamikaze, and there are a couple more, but those I think are quite a good initial starting point. So when we go through the poem, bear in mind if you can think about some links that you're going to make with a poem of your choice. Now, we are going to do a terminology test now, so have your pens at the ready and write down 1 to 6. Hopefully you can remember the terms that you learned with the last lesson. If not, go back and listen to lesson 1, which was on exposure. You've got some new terms today and some old terms because I want you to build on this memory. So 1 to 6. Number 1, enjambment. Number 2, simile. Number 3, juxtaposition. Number 4, metaphor. Number 5, caesura. And number 6, allusion. So pause here, give yourself time to have a guess at all of these, even if there are some that you haven't seen before. So some quite advanced terminology that you might not be used to, but have a guess. Okay, and give yourself a mark out of 6, copying out the correct definitions. Pause here to make sure you've got them all written down because you're going to be searching for these particular terms when we read through the poem on the next slide. So you need to make sure you're aware of what they are. Okay, Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw. In raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment, then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations? Was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide, open silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet towards the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries and yelling alarm, to get out of that blue crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. Now, we've got some questions on the side which are for you to think about what is happening in the poem. It is a very, very challenging poem. And it's meant to be quite confusing because that is one of the emotions that he is trying to put across, the soldier's confusion. So try and go through and pause this video here to go through and answer the questions for each stanza. I've put up here a number of different images. I want you to find the quotation that refers to each of these images so you can try and build the picture that Hughes is trying to put across for you. Think about how they might link to his ideas on war. And maybe push yourself to think about if they are similar or different to any of the other poets' ideas about war. Now, we're going to go through this stanza. I've underlined some of the things that I'm going to talk about. If you want to pause the video now and see what you can annotate yourself, in particular, if you can talk about any of the techniques at the bottom, if you can identify any of them. Now, suddenly he awoke. So we've got this sort of panic through the adverb suddenly, and the reader and the soldier seem to have arrived in the middle of this chaos, okay, in the middle of the charge. So this suddenly and the fact that he is awoken, what's he awoken from? You know, is he in some sort of dream state? Is it like a living nightmare? These are things that I want you to think about and how they put across this idea of panic which Hughes is trying to get across. And was running raw. In raw seemed hot khaki. Now we've got repetition of raw here, and this actually is where we see an allusion to perhaps a previous poem that was written by Wilfred Owen, where we have some sort of clumsy repetition. If you want to actually learn more about that, Mr. Bruff talks about it on one of his podcasts. I suggest you watching it. But that is where we see an allusion, a reference to something else. Was running raw, in raw seemed hot khaki, his sweat heavy. So we've got kind of the repetition of the R and the H sound, which might be like heavy breathing, again showing this panic. Why has raw been emphasised here? You know, maybe he is so confused that the soldier can't really think of any other adjectives, you know, because his brain is so overwhelmed with what's going on. Stumbling, again, showing the fact that he's struggling, showing confusion. Maybe he's tired. The green hedge sort of juxtaposes the fact that this is a battle scene. You think of trenches as just muddy and brown. So it's almost like he's struggling to get to something normal, something natural. because he's so out of his comfort zone. So that's quite an unusual reference there with that green hedge. That dazzled with rifle fire. The use of dazzled again shows confusion, but also perhaps shows that maybe there's like a misunderstanding in place. Like if you're dazzled by something, you're almost bewitched by it. You're dazzled by diamonds, so not by rifle fire. So perhaps we've got an undertone here, which we'll talk about later, of maybe deception, and this soldier who has gone to war believing that he is being patriotic, and he is has sort of believed all of the propaganda around the war, is now dazed and dazzled with rifle fire, as it's not how he expected it to be. Bullets smacking the belly out of the air. The personification here showing the power of the enemy. Smacking, very aggressive verb, quite childlike as well. You think of a smacking as like a telling off that you have when you're naughty and young, and it might show the soldier's vulnerability here. Smacking the belly out of the air again shows quite how overwhelming this scene is. Lugged a rifle, numb as a smashed arm. So we've got simile here, again quite violent, the fact that an arm being smashed. This is probably because this soldier, all he can see around him is violence and injury. Patriotic tear that's brimmed in his eye. The reference here, again, an allusion to perhaps, the reason why he went to war, maybe this feeling of noble and fighting a good fight and for king and for country. And that sort of common misconception and misunderstanding with World War One was really that soldiers had no idea what they were letting themselves in for. Another simile with sweating like molten iron. Again, this kind of reference here, burning hot molten iron, shows the violence and the strength. It is only extreme conditions where iron will melt, and those extreme conditions are how the soldier is feeling at the moment. Think about the use of the dashes here as well, perhaps also showing a breakup of this running effect. The fact that there is unnatural pauses, the fact that there is enjambment, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. It's very disjointed, and again that might emulate being out of breath. Patriotic is normally something that we have positive connotations of as well, but yet a tear is so negative. So perhaps this kind of juxtaposition between the two again builds on the fact that maybe his country have let him down by letting him believe that he should be doing this war. That might just be me reading way too much into this, so you don't necessarily all need to write that in your exam. There are more things to talk about with this stanza, but I'll leave some of them for you to come up with yourselves, and so I'm going to move on to stanza 2. As the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame. We've actually got enjambment between these two stanzas. And we see this presence of a hare, so like a rabbit. And again, it's like really quite unnatural, like the green hedge that he was running towards. Why have we got this natural imagery in the middle of a very dangerous battlefield? It's quite unusual, but again, it might be a metaphor for another soldier, perhaps. Perhaps he's, trying to dehumanise them. Often with war poetry, you as a way of detaching from what you're doing and from the killing, you have methods of doing that, and that might be one of those. Yellow is normally, the colour is normally associated with being a coward. That might be relevant. Rolled like a flame, we've got another simile here, perhaps out of control. Flame, we know, has connotations of hell, danger, things like that. Crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide, open, silent, its eyes standing out. It's bewildered, this hare, if it is in fact a hare. Plunged past. So he is, really fully engrossed in this now, with his bayonet towards the green hedge. king, honour, human dignity, etc. The use of this list, perhaps another reference to the reasons behind him going to war, the things that he would have been sold back home. You know, the patriotic tier again links in with this quite nicely. This use of this list almost desensitizes him to it. They're not important anymore. King means nothing, honour means nothing, human dignity means nothing, etc. So the use of that etc. there is quite powerful, because those are normally things that would have very, very strong significance and I think would be very important. But the use of etc. means that it's almost like he's writing a shopping list: apples, bananas, eggs, bread, etc. You know, so it's really reducing, it's quite a reductive statement. Dropped. Does he now disregard these things? Dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm. So what he means here is the things that we would cherish, but yet we don't consider important in a time of need. That's what these things are. Just if your house is on fire, you're not running to grab your pearl necklace, or maybe you are. You shouldn't be. You should be running to get out and save your children or your husband and the pet. Okay, so these are things that human dignity is not a luxury he can afford anymore. Perhaps showing his lack of regard for the war. He is just a soldier that is being used. He is a weapon. He has been reduced himself. To get out of that blue crackling air, the onomatopoeia again brings the additional sound element. We have this quite a lot with war poetry, where they use sibilants and onomatopoeia to give that extra dimension. We've seen sibilants earlier. Sibilants is the hissing sound, which might be like gunshots, and again this crackling gives another dimension. His terror's touchy dynamite. Again, dynamite, explosive. Perhaps he is the weapon here, but also perhaps represents what danger he is actually in. The alliteration here could emphasise the adrenaline, the fear, and again really just talks about the horror that he is feeling. You know, dynamite is something that is feared, and I think throughout the whole of this play we just see quite how unexplainably horrific this experience would be to a soldier. And when we can see across all three stanzas, he uses a number of similes, and that might represent that it is just, there is no way to explain what is happening, so you have to use a simile because you don't have any other frame of reference unless you are there. Okay, so I've not gone through everything. I've not pointed out every simile or every rhetorical question. These are things that I think it's important that you find a lot of them for yourself, but hopefully this has helped you understand some more about the specifics in the poem. Okay, so once you have finished copying out your annotations and you've thought about what is being said and how it's being said, I want you to try and think about the following things. And I want you to draw a chart or make a list of Bayonet charge and another poem for comparison. Now, it's important that you understand not just where things are similar, but also where things are different and how things have been put across. That's how you get the high marks in this exam. Now, whichever poem you want to choose for comparison is absolutely fine. I've given a few suggestions that I think are some of the really strong ones, but it will be dependent on the question, because you might get asked, how does the poet present fear in Bayonet charge and one other? And that might want a slightly different focus to how does the poem present conflict, or how does the poet present confusion, or an enemy. So it depends. It really does depend on the question, because some are better than others. I've just put exposure, charge of the Light Brigade, and war photographer, because I think those are ones where there's quite a bit that you can do to talk about in the exam. Now, for bayonet charge, I want you to think about the meaning and the message. I've touched on this a little bit, but it's important that you try and come up with this yourself. I want you to look through and I want you to think about the main types of imagery that Hughes uses. Okay, so imagery is, of course, personification, metaphors, similes. Why are they used? How are they used? Think about the tone of the poem. Now, try and move away from just positive tone and negative tone. Try and be more specific. Is it panicked? Is it desperate? Is it casual? Is it nostalgic? Try and see if you can be more specific rather than just it's horrible or it's sad. Think about how it's been structured. Remember, saying something for structure just so that you can comment on it is not very worthwhile. If you are going to talk about the fact that it has 3 stanzas, try and think about what's significant. It's very similar to in your language paper where you have question 3. Just saying that there's 3 stanzas isn't very helpful. If you can say that Hughes breaks up the stanzas by initially us being in the middle of the action, then there is this element of contemplation, and then there is the inevitable ending, then that shows that you understand Hughes's journey. Okay, so if you're talking about structure, which of course you can talk about the enjambment, you can talk about this caesura, which we actually see in the 2nd stanza in the 3rd line. But talk about the significance, that's the important bit. Okay, it's significant because it shows the confusion of the battlefield, shows the disorder, things like that. That they're important that you talk about why and how it is effective. The last thing is the language. So the language that has been used, I've talked about some of the adjectives, but again, don't just say he uses adjectives. It's not helpful. Why is suddenly important? Okay, what does that add to the poem? What about the verb smacking? Why is that significant? So the language choices. Why did he choose that word instead of a different word? Then I want you to do the same for a different poem. If you've just done the first lesson on exposure and you are new to the poems, you can perhaps make this chart for exposure. But if you're coming back to this, then you can do it for any of the poems in the cluster. I would give yourself a while to do this because this will be a useful revision source to have. When you're revising in the summer, it will be very important that you have these sheets where you have the links of the message, the imagery, the tone, the structure and the language. To remember that, if you want to remember it, you can say, my itchy toes smell loads. And if you know in about 2 poems, it will be very easy when you're writing your comparative essay to structure your paragraphs, because you could literally take one of these per paragraph to talk about. Okay, this is just for if you struggle building paragraphs. I've picked out some key points and some key quotations for you to talk about, okay? Because it's really important that you are able to be slightly more diverse in what you're saying about the poetry, rather than just saying the readers feel sorry for the soldier, or it is a scary, it is frightening. You want to try and think about what links to what. So I've just picked out 3 ideas here, which is desperation, horror and confusion. I think these are 3 of the main emotions that come across, and they're slightly more specific than just afraid, but also would be quite useful to compare to another poem where they might be slightly different. And I want you to match the quotations to the point that Hughes is making. So Hughes wants to portray the soldier's desperation. Which of these quotes would be best to explain that? And then if you can perhaps come up with some different emotions and some different quotations that you could link, or perhaps mix and match them. I'd give yourself 5 minutes to do this task, just to really think about those quotes. These are some of the good ones to remember. So if Bayonet Charge doesn't come up, let's remember that was the poem of choice of the 2017 May exam. So it might not come up for a couple more years. However, it doesn't mean that you can't talk about bayonet charge. So if you understand this poem really well and exposure comes up, or Charge of the Light Brigade, or a number of the other war poems, it would be helpful if you had a few key quotations that you can remember. So some easy ones like bullets smacking, okay, terror's touchy dynamite, just the word suddenly, stumbling. These are things that aren't tricky to remember if you start early enough. I've put an additional slide in here for people that struggle with writing essay paragraphs. So I've given a model paragraph, which can then be not copied, but you can use the same framework with one of the different quotations that I've put at the bottom. So I'm going to read through my model paragraph, and then I want you to see if you can try your own. This might be an activity that you come back to if you are just doing the revision stage at the moment. But it's definitely good to make sure that you get practice at how you're phrasing things, so that you are not sounding like everyone else in the country. So this is just one that I just came up with quite quickly. Hughes uses confused language in the poem Bayonet Charge to demonstrate the chaotic scene of war. So I've initially got my point there. What's he doing? How's he doing it? Stumbling across a field, ... dazzled with rifle fire, suggests the movement and the panic of the soldier. The verb stumbling connotes an inexperience of war, and he is aware that he is going towards his certain death. This juxtaposes the dazzled, which portrays war as an amazing sight to behold. The positive connotations are unexpected, suggesting that men were lied to and dazzled by war propaganda. So here so far I've already included the evidence where I've zoomed in on two keywords. I've used some subject terminology with juxtaposes and verb and connotations. So I shall carry on with my analysis. This confusion and chaos evokes sympathy for the soldier. Misinterpretation of war is similarly presented by Owen in Exposure. Both poets, despite different time periods, want the reader to see the true realities of war in all its horror, and think about the young, inexperienced men who were sent to fight for their country under the guise of patriotism. Now, obviously, I'm a pro, so it doesn't automatically need to sound like that straight away. However, if you can try and integrate your link, it will mean that it sounds a lot more natural. So the way in which I have said both poets, despite different time periods, I've got my comparisons there. Okay, because they have a similar message, both Owen and Hughes. In fact, Wilfred Owen was very, very influential on Ted Hughes, and he really did look up to him and really did enjoy a lot of his poems. So they have very, very similar messages, and I've touched on that. However, I've gone into a lot more depth with the poem that I'm talking about and how they get across those messages that might be slightly different. The last thing you want to do then is you want to fill out your chart so that you can remember just key information about bayonet charge, some key quotes. I think ideally having 3 quotes to try and remember is a really good starting point. If you try and remember 10 quotes per poem, you're not going to go into that exam with a sound knowledge of the majority of the poems. So if you try and start with 3, that's ideal.